It's been called the most significant Christian apologetic writing or work in the 20th century. And I think it's because it's so accessible. And we'll bump into that word. Dick Vesperman, how you doing? How are you?
I'm fine.
Now that I know you're there, I'm going to ask questions of you. What does apologetic mean? Quick, look it up.
Rational defense.
Yeah, he used the word defense. And that's exactly what the Greek word apologia means. And Peter says in 1 Peter 3:15, be ready to give a defense for the hope that lies within you. And so that's where we get the idea of apologetics. And that's exactly what Lewis is doing. He was an atheist. Then what was he? He traveled from atheist to theism. So he went from there is no God to, okay, there's a God. And that's what he does in the book as well. He doesn't really get into Christianity until a little bit later. So he goes from atheism, no God, to theism, there is a God, to Christianity. And that's his apologetic, and that's the reason for his hope. So, wow, I was afraid I wouldn't have enough to say.
That'll be the day.
Yeah. Let me mute the let me mute the old guy over here. 1940s, Great Britain. Lewis's voice, according to Wikipedia, became as recognizable in the 40s as Winston Churchill's voice. And that's saying something. During World War II, the book has since become among the most popular evangelical works in existence. In 2006, Mere Christianity was placed third in Christianity Today's list of most influential books since 1945. Chuck Colson, anybody remember who he was? He was converted to faith in prison by reading Mere Christianity. So kind of cool. Chuck Colson writes well. I don't know who these other guys are. Oh, Francis Collins. Does anybody know who he is?
Yeah.
The chair of
Heads up the National Institute of Health.
Yeah, Institute of Health. He is a magnificent Christian speaker. He's right there in the trenches with the COVID virus and all that's going on. And he also was an atheist, studying physics and biology and all that stuff. And in reading Mere Christianity, it was one of the building blocks for him to come to faith in Christ. And he is a fun and humble apologist, giving a defense for the faith. And so I wish we heard more from him, and maybe we'll study some of his work as we go forward. So Francis Collins, I mentioned some of his works. He was born before any of you in 1898, right? And passed away in 1963, 55 minutes after JFK was assassinated, on the same day of Aldous Huxley's death. And Lewis's, of course, was very popular, but his passing in such proximity to the assassination of the president, so his passing went virtually unnoted. It was basically a footnote. And there was even a book written called Between Heaven and Hell, which was a dialogue, an imagined dialogue. It was a Christian writer, imagined dialogue between JFK, C.S. Lewis, and Aldous Huxley as they're waiting in purgatory. And I discovered that. They had heard about it but forgot about it, so I'm going to look that up. That sounds very interesting as well. Between Heaven and Hell, yeah. So more than 30 books, yada, yada, yada. He entered Oxford in 1917, studying at University College, and shortly after he joined the Officers Training Corps. 1917, what was about to erupt? World War I, or was it already erupted? Okay, already erupted. And he was drafted into a cadet battalion for training, commissioned into the 3rd Battalion of the Somerset Light Infantry. On his 19th birthday, he arrived at the front line in the, is it Somme or Somme Valley? Is that France? I'm not sure how to say that, where he experienced trench warfare. So our apologist for our faith as a young man experienced something that's some of the worst experience in human history, qualified to be introspective, I think, qualified to talk about things like the problem of pain and sin and all of that stuff. On April 18th, he was wounded and 2 of his colleagues were killed by a British shell that fell short. And he suffered from depression and homesickness as he was convalescing. When he recovered, he was assigned to duty in Andover, England, and then he was demobilized in 1918 and returned to his studies. He's an atheist during all this, but he had been baptized into the Church of Ireland as a child. And so he did have some faith in his family. This article says, in the latter, Lewis cited that his experience of the horror of war, along with the loss of his mother and his unhappiness in school, were the basis of his pessimism and atheism. You begin to read Mere Christianity, he'll reference this stuff, and you'll find that one of the little keys that unlocked the door to considering that there is a God was that he was so angry with the God that didn't exist for all the bad things that were going on. So he'll turn that upside down, and it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Let me see, on his 19th birthday, I did that one already. Very good. After the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, the Lewises, he and his brother took evacuee children from London to other cities, I guess, to keep them safe. He was 40 when the war started. He tried to re-enter the military, and they wanted him to do cadet instruction, and then they wanted him to engage in radio broadcasts for the psychological warfare, and he refused to do it because he didn't want to tell lies. And so he's getting some, I guess, some ethical standards at that point with regard to his faith. From 41 to 43, he spoke on the BBC's religious programs, and that's part of what we are reading, all of that. Air Chief Marshal Donald Hardman wrote, "The war, the whole of life, everything tended to seem pointless. We needed, many of us, a key to the meaning of the universe. Lewis provided just that." And man, if you can provide meaning in that environment, you've got something worth listening to, even in the 21st century. 1961, Lewis began suffering a kidney disorder called nephritis. He suffered, got better, suffered, got better. In 1963, on July 15th, he fell ill and was admitted to the hospital, suffered a heart attack. The next day, lapsed into a coma. After waking, the next day, was discharged. Wow. It's like, okay. He was too ill to return to work. He continued to decline. He collapsed in his bedroom on November 22nd at 5:30 p.m., 1 week before his 65th birthday, and died a few minutes later. He's buried in the churchyard of the Holy Trinity Church, Headington, Oxford. His brother Warren died in April of '73. So they were very close. And as I mentioned, media coverage was almost non-existent because of the coverage of the assassination of JFK. I made a list of all of his books. I am not going to read that to you, but you can Google that. And I just wrote at the end of the list, holy smokes, this guy was prolific and in different genres. And see, I'm just turning pages of his works here so we can get off of that. Okay. Why are apologetics important, Dick?
Why are they important?
Yeah.
Well, hard to say.
I can put you on the spot on Zoom because you cannot reach out and touch me. Anyone want to take a shot at why apologetics are important?
Apologetics are important. I got it.
Yeah.
Apologetics are important so you can explain what it is that you believe with confidence to someone else who, if they ask you, if you're having a conversation.
Yeah, so it's important for us to be able to articulate the reason for our faith. And the only way to get there is not by saying, well, that's what mama told me, right? It takes a little bit of study, a little listening to the Spirit, some reading of the scripture, and sometimes some reading of people like C.S. Lewis. So thank you, Cindy. Yeah, it's important to our faith, but I, somewhere along the line, became annoyed with apologetics because when you're giving a defense of the Christian faith, and Lewis will allude to this in his preface, are you really giving a defense of the Christian faith, or are you giving a defense of your denominational understanding of the Christian faith, or of your party, or whatever it is? And so just as if I were to go out into the general community and start talking about Jesus to people, Lewis also had to thread a needle between the hot topics of his day in the 40s, with whether it was how he would speak to Roman Catholics about the virgin birth, or how he would speak to Methodists about John Wesley, or whatever it was. He knew that in order to be effective in communicating just the mere essence of what Christianity is, he would have to leave the hot topics alone. And he doesn't leave them all alone, but he leaves the ones alone that he feels like if he talks on them, it's just going to stir up anger. And that just sounds like wisdom, doesn't it? His point was not to win. His point was to share why it's rational and reasonable to follow Christ in the end. So apologetics is important. And I'm going to introduce some of you for the first time to a word you haven't heard, maybe. And then some of you have heard this word and you know what it means. And some of you have heard this word and you're like, really, are we going there? And yeah, we are. Candace, the word is post-modern. Yeah. Postmodernism. How many of you have heard that word before, that phrase? Okay. I started college in 1979-80. Postmodernism started clipping along around 1960. So, and if you have a post something, then you have a pre something, right? And so there was pre-modern, and then there was modern. I'll represent by Mod, and by the way, Mod Pizza, good pizza. That's a plug. We like it. Thin crust, cheap, fast. Go there. Tell them I sent you. So before the modern age, we might think, I'll just try and simplify it. So pre-modernism. Before the modern age, people generally had a sense that there was a God, a deity ran things, right? There was not a whole lot of dialogue about, I'm at a loss for words right now. Things were generally accepted, mystical explanations, etc. In the modern world, which started, I think began in earnest after the Enlightenment, okay? People begin to look for reasons, right? Why do we believe what we believe? And it was smack dab in the height of modernism that C.S. Lewis became a communicator and a thinker. And so the 20th century was philosophically busy. And a lot of the isms that arose in the 20th century became deadly and horrible, right? Socialism, Nazism, fascism, all of this stuff. But almost all of these isms had an undergirding of some philosophical teaching that we're moving from the pre-modern age to the modern age. And for lack of a better way to explain it, and trust me, I've studied it and I'm still confused, is at the end of the 20th century, we look back as humans and went, oh, that didn't go so well, you know? And my generation, like boomers and then our children, looked back at modernism and said, no thanks. Yeah, you can keep your organized church, you can keep your institutions, or you can send them somewhere unpleasant, right? And postmodernism began to throw out not just the baby, but the bathwater and the bathtub and the bathroom and everything associated with how we think the world is or the world might be. And how many of you have heard the term in the last 30, 40 years, moral relativism? That was kind of a touchstone that was reactionary as postmodernism began to take a foothold in universities and around the world. And so we are here. And if you were to begin to study what postmodernism is, what it looks like, you would begin to go, oh, that's why we are now looking at things this way. And essentially, again, I'm not qualified to teach on this, even though I just read a whole bunch of stuff. Postmodernism essentially says your truth is your truth. My truth is my truth. And the one thing you can't nail down is, what is truth? Yeah. Que veritas, right? Well, what is truth? That's why it's important, I think, to go back to C.S. Lewis and people like that and go, okay, we've had a whole lot of years of trying to think open-mindedly, and that's magnificent. There have been real benefits to the world of postmodern thinking because some of the things in the modern world needed to go bye-bye, right? Still do. And so humanity needs to free ourselves from things that are detrimental and harmful, but we need to try and maintain an anchor with ideas and thoughts and teachings, philosophies that make us better. And C.S. Lewis is making that argument. And I think if he was alive and teaching today, he would know this argument. He would understand it. He actually deals with a little bit of it in his writings because it is starting to emerge in the hallowed halls of the academy in Europe and other places. But you still got to come back to this. Is there truth? Is there a God? And if so, how can we know? And can we be confident and competent in our defense, our apologia of the faith? And quite frankly, there are things in Christian denominationalism to which you can make no defense, right? And then there are things that need to be defended. Lewis's goal is to weave that basket out of the things that we can defend and to pretty much stay away from the hobgoblins of weird theological drift. Let me see. Any questions about that? Can anybody clarify? Yeah. Fantastic.
In the preface, he says, one of the things Christians disagree about is the importance of their disagreements.
Yeah.
When two Christians of different denominations start arguing, it is usually not long before one asks whether such and such a point really matters, and the other replies, matters, why it's absolutely essential. That's postmodernism.
Yeah. But Presbyterians in the 20th century were right there. We were, the theologians were writing volumes of commentaries and you got really solid kind of Orthodox evangelical commentary from most of your really thoughtful Presbyterian professors. Our denomination has adopted, I'm painting myself into a corner, and I know I'm doing it, but I don't want to be too broad, but you can see postmodernism in some of the ways we approach social issues, denominational issues, theology, and that is a and the eruption came as churches began to leave. It was not just about sexuality. It was not just about, but it's a whole nother philosophical way of seeing the world and understanding God. But I've been here now since 2009, and I'm pretty sure you all believe stuff, you know, that I don't think I've ever heard anyone at this church say, well, your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth. But I think we at least strive to say there is something that's real that unites us all, and that would be our faith. So if you have taught on this at the university level, anybody, and you want to throw a correction or two our direction, I would be thrilled for that. Okay, I'm gonna move over toward the preface. Candace just gave us an intro to it. I want you to know, if you don't have a book, I printed the first, you can download a PDF. Does anybody not have a copy of the book and would like to begin reading? This is like the first 5. This is called book 1. And I just downloaded that. I printed on one of these printers, so you owe her like 40 cents. And then you can highlight that and everything else too. But please help yourself to what Richard is getting over there if you feel so inclined. So he divides the work into 4 books. The first one is book 1, Right and Wrong as a Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. And that's both his lived experience and his thought process. Book 2, What Christians Believe. He will tell you in a minute, he's not going to go into theological depth. Book 3, Christian Behavior. So what we believe and then how we behave. And then book 4, Beyond Personality, or First Steps in the Doctrine of the Trinity. And that will be interesting by the time we get there. So his preface, I will just read a few highlighted things. And if you have it and you want to read along, you may. If you would like me to stop, and if you have questions or comments, just say so. But Lewis writes, the contents of this book were first given on the air, then published in 3 separate parts as The Case for Christianity in 1943, Christian Behavior in 43, Beyond Personality in 45. In the printed versions, I made a few additions to what I had said at the microphone, but otherwise left the text much as it had been. A talk on the radio should, I think, be as much like a real talk as possible and should not sound like an essay being read aloud or like what Craig is doing right now. In my talks, I had therefore used all the contractions and colloquialisms I ordinarily use in conversation. In the printed version, I reproduced this, putting don't and we've for do not and we have, and wherever in the talks I had made the importance of a word clear by the emphasis of my voice, I printed it in italics. And then he says, I'm now inclined to think that it was a mistake. An undesirable hybrid between the art of speaking and the art of writing. A talker ought to use variations of voice for emphasis because his medium naturally lends itself to that method, but a writer ought not to use italics for the same purpose. So Lewis is a writer who gave talks. I mean, he is a literary scholar, right? And who were his friends at Oxford? Does anybody remember? Tolkien, yeah. He's a noteworthy one, you know. Tolkien was Roman Catholic, I believe, and tried to convert C.S. Lewis from Anglicanism, and he wouldn't convert, but that's okay. And then just an aside, have you read The Hobbit and all of those things? Would you rather have C.S. Lewis or Tolkien write your obituary?
Elvish.
In Elvish, yeah. Tolkien, I mean, Lewis is like Narnia. It's very accessible. I remember, I think we gave Brienne The Hobbit when she was way too young. And it gets pretty deep and scary and all that stuff. She's still afraid of spiders, by the way. There was a very mean spider in Middle Earth. But who was to know that like Tolkien would explode in the last few decades and become almost a cult following of his work. Lewis's works being made into movies never really, like the BBC Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe that came out, I think, in the 60s or 70s, it was silly. It was hard to watch. And then it was maybe 5 or 6 years ago when the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was made into a major motion picture. Again, it was a little less than his friend Tolkien, but I guess that's okay. So the reader, I'm in the maybe the 3rd paragraph of the preface. The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between two Christian denominations. You will not learn from me whether you ought to become an Anglican, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, or a Roman Catholic. Now, I will tell you which one you should be, Lewis was. The omission is intentional. Even in the list I have just given, the order is alphabetical. What is he referencing? Why is he being soft there, walking gently? Yeah, because it's like the early church didn't get out of the gate before they split over which apostle you belong to. Remember in 1 Corinthians, the apostle Paul said that some said we're of Paul, some said of Apollos, some said, well, we're of Peter. And of course, then the Presbyterian said, well, we're of Jesus. So there you go. And John Calvin. They are the same person, if you didn't know. So he is sensitive to the fact that God has given him a voice for Christianity to talk about important things. And so he's artful and intentional about it. There is no mystery about my own position. I am a very ordinary layman of the Church of England. I would call that false humility. He's not ordinary. He says, not especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else. But in this book, I am not trying to convert anyone to my position. Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. I had more than one reason for thinking this. In the first place, the questions which divide Christians from one another often involve points of high theology or of ecclesiastical history, church history, which ought never be treated except by real experts. That was a clever way of not wading into the cesspool. I should have been out of my depth in such waters, more in need of help myself than able to help others. Secondly, I think we must admit that the discussion of these disputed points has no tendency at all to bring an outsider into the Christian fold. So if you want to argue the finer points of the virgin birth of the Trinity, go ahead and argue, but nobody's coming to faith because of that, right? And that, well, that's really important to think about. So long as we write and talk about them, we are more likely to deter someone from entering any Christian communion than to draw them into our own. Our division should never be discussed except in the presence of those who have already come far more, let me see if I'm right. Already come far more and more talented authors were already engaged. No, I missed something. It didn't print out. What did I miss? Go ahead and read it, Mars. What I missed. Already come what? To. Okay. Wendy's printer cut it off. And there's a lot more. Read like you're yelling at the kids. Okay, very good. The part of the line where I thought I could serve best was also the part that seemed thinnest, and to it I naturally went. And so he says, these were my only motives. I should be very glad if people would not draw fanciful inferences from my silence on certain disputed matters. And he will talk about that to some degree. Why he doesn't, I love what he said about talking with Catholics about the virgin birth. He said, the Roman Catholic beliefs on that subject are held not only with the ordinary fervor that attaches to all sincere religious belief, but very naturally with the peculiar and, as it were, chivalrous sensibility that a man feels when the honor of his mother or his beloved is at stake. And so you want to talk about why there's no virgin birth with the Roman Catholic. You're insulting someone's mother as well as their theology. And he's like, not going to touch it. Maybe he had that discussion with Tolkien, in private, but Lewis is no fool about that. You cannot even conclude from my silence on disputed points either that I think them important or that I think them unimportant, for this is itself one of the disputed points. One of the things Christians are disagreed about is the importance of their disagreements. And this is what Candace wrote. And it's kind of a postmodern thing. So when two Christians start arguing, well, one says, does it really matter? And the other one says, that's absolutely essential. All this is said simply in order to make clear what kind of book I am trying to write, not in the least to conceal or evade responsibility for my own beliefs. And so he wrote other books about inspiration and about pain and different things. And so you can read them. One of the things, oh my goodness, where was it that I read it? What book? I have used C.S. Lewis's argument for why your pets go to heaven more times than any other thing he ever taught. And he had this wonderful deductive theological reasoning because he had a dog and a cat that coexisted peaceably with each other. And he built the case that in the wild, one would have destroyed the other, right? Depending on how big the cat is, I guess. But under his roof, he being a creation of God, right? He being kind of the God figure to that cat and that dog, had kind of redeemed them and lifted them from their pure savage instincts into being able to get along. And he kind of argued that that's, well, God kind of does that for us too, right? And so he says that compassionately, not just to make an off point, but to say, you know what, go ahead and have hope that that pet you couldn't live without, that is gone, might greet you in heaven someday. You guys like that? Yeah. I'll probably have a dog that's going to bite me when I go to the other place, but that's a whole nother thing. So, so he's written a lot about a lot of things. He doesn't want anybody to convert to the Church of England just because of him, but I'm sure a lot of people did. The Methodists thought I had not said enough about faith. The Catholics thought I had gone too far about the comparative unimportance of theories and the explanation of the atonement. Otherwise, he and 4 others where he submitted this stuff to got through it. So he did kind of submit his thoughts for peer review, and it's pretty good. Well, let me see here. I don't want to read everything verbatim. If I have not directly helped the cause of reunion, bringing Christians together, I have perhaps made it clear why we ought to be reunited. Certainly, I have met with little of the fabled odium theologicum. Let the listener decide what that means. From convinced members of communions different from my own. Hostility has come more from borderline people, whether within the Church of England or without it. Men not exactly obedient to any communion. This I find curiously consoling. It is at her center where her truest children dwell, that each communion is really closest to every other in spirit, if not in doctrine. Have you ever had the chance to be with someone of another denomination and you had almost instant simpatico of your spirit, right? I mean, and I was taught as a child that Catholics were not Christian. And then as I got older, I began to meet Catholics who were well more Christian than I thought I was. And I think that's what Lewis is capturing. He's not trying to say if you agree with him, obviously you agree with him because you're closer to Christ. What he's saying is that those who are more in tune with the Spirit probably have a sense of commonality. I think that's what he's saying. There are always going to be people who argue with everything. He talks a lot about words, about what things like the word gentleman used to mean and what it doesn't mean now. And he has to be attuned to this, and so do we. This is what we call hermeneutics, I think, a study of the text. We do this of the scripture. We want to know what the apostles wrote, what the prophets wrote, but we want to know what they meant when they said it. What was their context? And that is very modern, right? Textual criticism and historical criticism was coming out of Switzerland, Germany in the mid-20th century. You've heard of Karl Barth and those guys. And so the whole idea that we were diving into the text of scripture to try and figure out what the authors were meaning when they said what they said. And that is, if that has gone away with postmodernism, then shame on the world, because we still need to know that when Jesus said, turn your cheek, was he talking about your cheek, literally or figuratively, you know, and was he implying again and again and again? Yeah, Candace, you heard my thought. Yeah. Yeah, and so it's really an important thing. And Lewis is making that argument for hermeneutics in his own right. It's like, you know what, the word Christian may not mean anymore what it originally was meant to mean, right? And someone tell me where the word was first used. Anybody remember? Huh? Well, it was in Antioch, I think, and it was the Apostle Paul. I think it might have been Luke who wrote about it, but were those who were the little Christ, the ones who were emulating Jesus. Yeah. It was the disciples who accepted the teachings of the apostles. And so, well, what does it mean now? What are some of the uses of the word Christian now? How does it differ in the real world? It can be used to, it can be used
Why are
derogatorily.
Christians so?
Yeah, so it can be a marker of my heritage. Well, I'm Christian. It can be a designation of the type of music I listen to. I listen to Christian music, and words, theological words in particular, can travel through history and lose their meaning. And so we might bump into that when we hear. He uses some words that Pat will have to instruct us on, because I don't speak British, but I just speak, you know, California. Near the end of the preface, he talks about people's personal faith journeys. And he draws a kind of an analogy of, you're coming into a hall. The hall is where you're entering into faith, but there's a door that you must choose. You must choose a door. He's kind of representing denominationalism, I think. And a lot of people choose different doors, and you might open one door and get in there and go, oh, this place is not for me. I can see them when they come here on Sunday morning, and they're like, okay. No, but he made this really neat quote, and if I can't find it real fast, I'll just paraphrase it. The hallway is important, but it's in the room that there's a fire to draw near to, and that there's communion and conversation and food, right? So the relationship happens at the church level, the local church level, I think he might argue. And while people are out in the hallway, he said, that's also a blessed time. So perhaps someone is considering where to belong in terms of a denomination or a church fellowship. He's basically saying, don't resent the time in the hallway. God is doing something in you while you're out there. And you might find that it took a number of years of being in the hallway before you could appreciate belonging to that particular room of people. And so that argument, that conversation, his non-denominationalism with regard to his mere Christianity conversation is very refreshing. And to be sure, he offended people by not speaking to certain issues, but he was wise enough to say, ask the theologians that question. So yeah, it wouldn't hurt you to read through that preface if you haven't, to read through it again, but I think you'll find what I have found is that C.S. Lewis is both competent to speak about what Christianity is, competent to have the philosophical conversations about, is there a God? Compassionate. He doesn't oust the weirdest pagan from being a child of God that can come into communion with Christ. And so Lewis looks at ancient religions. He was raised while Tolkien was writing about Middle Earth. Lewis was kind of practicing Middle Earth as a child, and he was very much into fairies and all the mythical and mystical stuff of European fable, I guess. And he comes to believe that even in the oddest pagan rituals out there, that somehow God is trying to reach humanity. And so he doesn't just dismiss people for their beliefs, but he tries to find ways to draw them toward Christ. And the Apostle Paul did it once in particular. Does anyone know where my mind is going with that, what I'm thinking about? In Athens, with the unknown God. Yeah, the Apostle Paul comes into Athens. He's grieved by all of the images, all the icons that are there, and he finds one dedicated to the unknown God. And instead of standing up and lambasting the Athenians for their paganism, he stands up and says, paraphrase, I've got news. I know who the unknown God is. Let me tell you about the unknown God who sent his son into the world to save the world. And so Lewis, I think, is channeling the apostle with regard to that, trying to meet people where they are and meet us where we are as well. So that's essentially my preview. When our printer is back online, some of what I read tonight, I will just hand out as notes, and you all can take them with you and look into them, especially if it's things about postmodernism. Because believe it or not, that's going to crop up in the things that we read. Most of you have looked at our society in the last decade or two and you have been grieved, right? So they're just at the tone of dialogue, at extremes, at people's inability to come together. Well, the adult education group, we went through Senator Sass's book, and we've known for a few years that we have to engage in meaningful conversation that brings us together. And I'm excited to think that Mere Christianity is going to be a good stepping stone to get us not only to talk to one another, which we already do, but to help teach us how to talk to other people graciously about things that are important.